It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
Are we going to push away the planning rules and make them clearer, as we've done today? Get away the blockers that are stopping the housing being built? Yes.
The government wants councils in England to build 370,000 homes a year. But what will that mean for local communities?
When you deny the local councillors a right to make decisions, when you ignore the feelings of the overwhelming majority of local residents, I call that very undemocratic.
New Brexit rules come in tomorrow for British goods being sold to the EU. We'll speak to small business owners worried about what the changes will mean for them.
What this has shown is that the Bank of England governor is a lot less sackable than the Prime Minister.
Indeed, not a democratic outcome.
It wasn't a democratic outcome.
Liz Truss blames civil servants and others for her downfall, but has the Conservative Party learnt the lessons from her time in office? Joining me today, Labour MP Natalie Fleet, Conservative peer Lord Frost, who negotiated Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, Shabna Begum, Chief Executive of the Runnymede Trust think tank, which campaigns for racial justice, and former government advisor Salma Shah. This is Politics Live. Hello, let's start with this headline in the Financial Times. It says, pay UK bosses like football stars, says Lord Spencer, former treasurer of the Conservative Party. He says boosting CEO salaries would help London's competitiveness. He goes on to say the US celebrates the fact that great chief executives can earn large amounts of money. They want their chief executives to be paid like football stars. Do you agree, Natalie?
No.
Why not?
In Bolsover, the average salary is £32,000. I am not here I'm not elected to make rich people richer.
What do you say, David Frost? Do you agree with your colleague in the House of Lords that actually it would make London more competitive?
Well, I am in favour of making people richer, whether they're poor, rich or whatever. I don't think there's anything that stops heads of companies being paid whatever the owners of those companies want. But I would say the difference is when footballers are failing, you could tell that. It isn't always true with CEOs.
Right. I mean, he goes on to say the CEO of BP or HSBC earns £20 million a year, materially less than their peer group in America. Should they be paid more?
It's up to the shareholders of those companies. What
do you think, Shabna? Do you agree with Lord Spencer we should pay our senior bosses like football stars?
I think this conversation is like the unwanted Christmas gift that keeps going round and around. And we keep having this conversation about CEO pay. And actually, CEOs are paid at 344 times the rate of an average worker's salary. So I think it's a big no. We need to be thinking about the people who are paid at the lowest end of the labour market in those insecure jobs. And so I'd agree with Natalie.
David?
We need everybody in this country to be paid more. That means boosting productivity, economic reform, a lot of things we're not getting from the current government.
I mean, pay, he cites, as one of the reasons why the UK was lagging behind other markets, such as the US. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think there is a point that he's making that is perfectly valid about the fact that the UK stock market isn't performing as well against some of its competitors. Part of that is our inability to attract the right levels of talent, and remuneration is going to be a factor in that. I think that if he's comparing it to footballers, first of all, the average footballer is actually paid less than the average UK or international chief executive, so it's probably not the best comparator. But the fundamental thing is that it's based on performance, and I don't have an issue with that.
I mean, senior Labour figure Peter Mandelson, many years ago, admittedly in the new Labour years, said he was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich as long as they pay their taxes. Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, said something similar, or she endorsed, I think, that sentiment. What's wrong with it?
This is a pro-business government. If people want to make money, that's absolutely fine, and we support that. And they're investing in our country and in growth. Brilliant. But ultimately, being in government is about priorities. When 54% of children in my area live in relative poverty. I was an anomaly. I lived in poverty. I know how it scars, and I know the impact it had on me. This is now not the exception, it is the rule. So if we are going to focus government's attention, we are going to focus it in the right areas on the poorest in society, people that have never struggled before, that now are struggling in the run-up to Christmas.
David?
You don't make the poor richer by making the richer poorer. You try and have an economic policy that lifts everybody through growth into wealth. That's what we need.
Didn't work over 14 years. That's what we've seen. Everybody get poorer.
We didn't do it as well as we should have, but it's still the right way to go about it.
I like that we can agree very early on.
I mean, it's true that Peter Mandelson has slightly rode back from those comments. I mean, it was also quite a few years ago when he said he didn't think, or he thought rather, that globalisation would improve everyone's lives. What do you make of that corrective?
Well, I think there is a bit of a pushback against, maybe some of the pre-2008 extremes of globalisation, but it is still true that free markets, economic change, growth, produce wealth and make everybody better off. And we saw a lot of that before 2008, and we've seen it more recently.
And what do you say to Natalie saying Labour is very pro-business still?
I think there has been a big reaction from business, certainly around the budget and the reversal on the NICS changes and the changes in tax thresholds, particularly for large employers who are seeing big costs to that. I think there is going to be a worry in the business community about the impact of new workers' legislation that's coming down the track. So I think saying that you're pro-business, but then also looking at the growth rates, the rhetoric doesn't necessarily match up to what we're seeing in terms of the numbers.
Well, let's talk about the centrepiece, or one of them, of the government's agenda, and that is a house-building programme committing to building 1.5 million new homes over the course of the Parliament. In the last hour, the government's announced changes to the planning rules. Let's hear from the Prime Minister.
Well, the starting point is local plans, and that's really important for councils to develop the plan according to the target, taking into account local need and working with developers. So that's where it starts. But are we going to push it through if those plans don't work? Yes, we absolutely are. Are we going to push away the planning rules and make them clearer, as we've done today? Get away the blockers that are stopping the housing being built? Yes, we absolutely intend. For years, we've had not enough houses being built. That means that individuals and families don't have the security that they want.
Well, you can see on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, they've picked up on the words or rhetoric of the Prime Minister. Labour bid to bulldoze the home counties and any objections. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth. That is pretty tough rhetoric there from the Prime Minister. But what does the actual policy amount to?
Well, there are a couple of key things about this, Jo. So this was first announced back in the summer. There's been a consultation taking place, and then this is the government's final response to it. One of the key things, they are sticking to this overall target to get more homes built. Over the course of the Parliament, 1.5 million, but the targets for councils every year collectively are 370,000 across England, broken down council by council. Despite the fact many local authorities saying, we just think that is almost impossible, the government wants to see it happen. They have tweaked some of the targets. So it looks like on initial reading of the figures, which we've only got in the last half an hour or so, some councils in London and the South East have seen their targets revised up even further, while other parts of the country have seen them go down. But overall, you heard Keir Starmer saying he wants to get those homes built. Now, part of the way they want councils to do this is look at the land that's available in their area. And in the first instance, they say, build on brownfield land. That's land that's previously been developed. But they're saying, if you can't find enough of that, look to your green belt. And where there is what the government calls low quality green belt land, then that has to be considered as suitable for building. The message from the government's really clear. They are saying that they don't want excuses from councils. They're prepared to intervene if councils don't deliver on this. But as you know, Jo, local development is often hugely contentious. So for all the government's messaging, I think there are still questions over delivery.
Yes, so how much opposition is there broadly amongst councils?
A lot of people share the ambition of building more homes because people have seen housing waiting lists rise, the number of people in temporary accommodation rise, people struggling to get on the housing ladder. So there is a widespread recognition something needs to be done. And talking to lots of local authorities across the country, a lot of them like the idea of house building. The question is the where and the how. And what you often find are councils saying, we're constrained when it comes to our land. We haven't got enough infrastructure. This has to go hand in hand with other things like affordable housing, making sure there are the GPs surgeries, the roads. The government's saying it's going to do that. There's a planning and infrastructure bill coming next year, as well as the planning reforms that we're seeing today. But I think the crux of the matter is this. The government has put this so high up its own agenda. It was in Keir Starmer's plan for change, this 1.5 million more homes, not just because of the housing issue, but also because they say it's really central to economic growth.
Yes.
But there are going to be case after case where they butt up against real local concern. And the question is whether ministers are really going to do what they say and just press on with this despite that.
Alex Forsyth, thank you very much. Is it right to force councils to build these homes?
What councils told me in the run-up to the election, and they continue to tell me now, is that they don't have enough powers. This is all about taking power away from huge developers and putting in more power with local authorities. I have never been as proud to be part of a Labour government. We have got a housing minister that understands the meaning of a council house. I was homeless when I was a child. I understand what it means for those families in Bolsover that are going to spend Christmas in temporary housing. It's not OK. We've now got a Labour government that's saying, we hear you, we understand you, whether it's because you are struggling, you're both working and you can't afford your rent, whether you can't afford to home. We hear you and we are going to intervene. We're going to build those houses.
But do you think it's democratic, as we heard in the headlines from a councillor, if the majority of people in the community object to a particular type of development, that they are ignored?
The reason this is democratic is twofold. The first of all is, in the run-up to the election, there's a development in my area called Clown Garden Village that people were incredibly unhappy about because of the infrastructure, not enough GP surgeries, the roads, and we're saying that we're absolutely going to be building these and we're going to be investing in infrastructure. Right. And then the second reason is that we were very, very clear about this in the run-up to the election. And people said, all the things that are on the front pages now, you're going to be building on greenfield sites. And I could say, no, we're not going to. We're going to prioritise brownfield sites. And they voted for us. This was in our manifesto. They gave us a huge mandate.
Well, let's bring the others in. David, do you agree we should force councils?
Actually, we are going to agree to quite a large extent again. I do think that we need to be serious about building more homes. If we had built in this country at the same rate as France, we'd have 4 million more houses and we wouldn't have the same housing problem. We've got to find a way of doing it. Now, there are two problems. One is the fact that we've got a rather anti-business government that is going to make it difficult for housing developers generally. And second, the elephant in the room is immigration. And I don't think it's going to be easy to find consent for building more houses until we show we're serious about
tackling immigration, which is absolutely what needs to happen.
I hope you do, but I'm afraid the instincts of the party are not really in favour.
We're already delivering on immigration. So the reason that in my area people they care about housing. And they also want a government that controls how many people we have living in this country. We've already sent back 9,400 people. We're looking at net migration. They voted 70% leave in my area. And then after they'd done that, primarily because of immigration, they then saw 4 times as much immigration. They've got a government that are delivering around immigration, delivering around house building for British people and people that British people need to live here. This is the government delivering.
Well, you're not delivering yet because you've only been in power 5 months. The changes and the reductions came in from the reductions that we made at the end of our time in office. Now, I hope you continue because people want immigration to come down. You've got to try and do that. We, as a party, need to do the same thing. But until it's controlled, it will be very difficult to get consent for the sort of house building that we need.
Do you agree with that point, Shabna?
I think we need to be really careful here because I think this idea of connecting immigration to the housing crisis is a constructed narrative that actually is divorced from the evidence. And I think that if we look at most migrants are not entitled to social housing. They are not entitled to public funds and they're certainly not entitled to social housing. So to make this direct connection as though it's immigration that's causing the housing crisis, I think is a false one. But I think what I'd like to come back to as well is the wider question around housing and the reforms that are proposed. Because the housing crisis has a disproportionate impact on people of colour. At the Runnymede Trust, we're doing an incredible amount of work looking at the relationship between housing, overcrowding, mould. We saw the death of Awab Ishaq, a toddler who died because of the exposure to black mould. This is the kind of housing that people of colour are disproportionately exposed to. And so therefore we do need to see an increase in the attention to the planning reforms and to be able to build more social housing. But I think there's a broader question here as well about the number of empty homes, repurposing empty homes, retrofitting new and existing properties, and really thinking about the broader housing system in the whole as well.
What do you say to Shabna's point about there being no evidence of linking housing shortages to immigration?
Well, in fact, when I worked in the housing department back in 2018, we had a look at this, and Shabna's correct. You cannot directly link the supply issue with immigration because, especially around social housing, there is no entitlement to it. So there'll be a lot of people who will worry about immigration because it's changing their communities. They will worry about access to public services, the perception of unfairness and injustice in terms of immigrants getting more. But actually, we have to do more to educate people that actually that direct correlation is there. I think the problem with this is that we keep talking about supply. The first person who brought in housing targets for local authorities was my boss when I was in the housing department, Sajid Javid. It was reversed at some point in the last government. But I would like to understand, with the reintroduction of the numbers, has anyone gone back and tried to estimate as to whether imposing those numbers had any net effect? Because we're not really judging this new policy by evidence. Everything that's been set out by Matthew Pennycook, everything that's been said by Labour, stuff that the Conservatives have already said or tried.
I mean, they built 1 million homes over the course of 5 years. You're wanting to build 1.5 million homes. What do you say in terms of the evidence that's there that you will be able to achieve it?
What we had is an absolute government of chaos, and that's part of the issue. So we're talking about one government minister that wanted to build, that had a target, and then it was taken away. So how can you assess it? What we had is 14 years of chaos. Some of the things that they did were good, and they decided that they didn't want to do them anymore.
You'd have 2 years of evidence to assess it.
2 out of 14, that's the issue.
Well,
it's just
I mean,
absolute
from the introduction
chaos
to its reversal, you would also be able to see what local authorities were doing in terms of planning permission. There's granular evidence that would be available to allow you to have a look at trends.
We can argue all we like now about statistics. This comes down to how people feel.
I'm not talking about statistics, I'm talking about evidence.
This is about whether they have somewhere safe to live over Christmas, whether they can go to work and afford to give their children and their family a good Christmas. It doesn't matter that you can say the last government did. People feel that the last government didn't do enough.
But it is important about statistics, isn't it? Because this is your pledge for 1.5 million homes. But one of the other issues, Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, tried to bring in wholesale reform of the planning system, and he couldn't because of political opposition.
That's right, and I think he could have if he'd forced it through. But the reform that we wanted was much more ambitious, I think, than the Labour reforms that we've heard about. Yes, because it brought in zoning, it reduced discretion.
You didn't bring it in. That's
we didn't. We didn't. It's a matter of great regret to me that we got forced off that, and we would be in a very different position now if we had managed to bring it in. There's no way of getting around the problem, whether it's social housing, private housing, whatever. The country needs more houses, and we've got to build them.
And I think there's broad agreement on that. What about local opposition, Shabna? Let's say it's for environmental reasons. Should local communities be listened to on that?
I think, of course, you involve local communities, but there is a much broader and chronic issue that we need to deal with, and we need to listen to local communities. I think some of the concerns that local communities will have is not just around the housing, but the infrastructure that is there to support the additional people that come into those residential homes.
Right.
So I think that there is a broader investment package that that has to go alongside this in order to reassure communities that they're not being inundated with people, which means that their schools and their doctor surgeries and their GP appointments are suffer as a result. And so I think that's why I come back to the point that this needs a holistic approach to not just looking at planning, looking at community infrastructure, looking at affordability and making sure that we address all of those concerns and don't just ignore them.
So Homes England, that was entirely what they were supposed to do. Their whole mission in their reset and reformation was about doing that land assembly piece that also brought in things like infrastructure and transport. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because currently we're in a situation where there is nobody who's in charge of Homes England, and that whole organisation has been decapitated, the chief executive and the chairman, who resigned recently, both together, which is pretty unheard of. So if you're thinking about how you do that delivery piece and how you're actually doing that infrastructure question, talking about how many GP appointments are going to be available, are we environmentally compliant? Actually, what's happening a step below ministers in those delivery bodies.
All right, let's move on. Have a look at this headline in The Eye. Small firms stop selling to EU and Northern Ireland over crazy Brexit rule change. A change to safety laws means firms face paying out thousands more a year to send products to the EU. These new rules are called General Product Safety Regulations. They create new requirements for businesses here selling to the EU and Northern Ireland, which effectively remained in the EU single market for goods after Brexit. Now, the rules also include the need for what's called a responsible person, which is effectively a compliance agent. Let's talk to Nigel and Adina Lacey. They run a company selling vintage motorcycle parts, and 25%, a quarter of their customer base, is in the EU. Hello to both of you. How will these new rules impact your business?
Hello. Well, you know, we understand the concept of what the EU is trying to do. But this one-size-fits-all just isn't going to work for us. We really can't see how we can comply to this due to the nature of the products that we sell, and also not only the short notice, but even with longer notice, I don't think we could have complied. We were only made aware of this by a friend in the Irish Republic who brought it to our attention. So we're reeling from this.
Right.
It's been very late in the day to actually find out. So we only found out about a week ago. This is implemented.
A week ago?
Tomorrow. So it should come into law then as such. And there just wasn't enough time for us to even contemplate doing anything about it.
How much trade do you do with the EU?
About 25% of our sales are with the EU. So it's a reasonable amount. But this business about an authorised representative in the EU for each, and it's an each product thing, so it's not just generally. So each product we've got to prepare a technical dossier and a safety assessment and log it with a representative. And if you believe what's written there, that they're suggesting that could be £150 a year for each product.
Right, so that is a lot of extra cost and time.
It is a lot of extra cost, as we've got about 1,000 products. So that would be £150,000 a year for us, if that's true. You know, obviously we're only reading what's being suggested, and bearing in mind our profit isn't that. So it's a joke basically. It's unworkable, and it doesn't make clear the actual legislation when you read it. We haven't had long to read it. It is not particularly clear. We did watch a webinar by the Department of Trade and Industry, and it seemed clear to me that they didn't really understand. All they were doing was trying to explain the regulations, and I'm not stupid, so I've read the regulations and I kind of understood it.
I'm sure you're not. I mean, how worried are you by all this? I mean, what will you stop trading or exporting to the EU?
That's the big question. Tomorrow, there's two choices. We either stop trading or we just ignore it and carry on. The interesting thing is that as part of our investigation into it, we've contacted a lot of our sort of manufacturers and suppliers,
in the UK.
And without fail, every single one of them had no idea. So I am left questioning why the Department of Trade and Industry haven't put this information, haven't put this information out. Or directed people towards it.
Well, we have politicians here and other guests in the studio, but David Frost is the architect of the Brexit deal. What do you say to Nigel and Adina?
Well, I say that I'm sorry that they have trading difficulties. That's very clear. But we must remember that these rules are brought in by the European Union, not by our government. The EU is a protectionist organisation. It always has been. It doesn't like free trade across its borders, and that's why we constantly get these proposals to control, to regulate, to make life difficult. And that's why, or it's one of the many reasons, that the British people voted to leave back in 2016, and I still think that was the right decision.
But you negotiated and agreed to that deal that has had this impact on businesses like Nigel and Adina's.
If you want to avoid this sort of friction, then you need to be subject to EU law, the EU Commission, the EU Court. We need to accept that our laws are not going to be made in this country. They're going to be made in Brussels, and we're not going to get a say in them. And that is the trade-off that we negotiated. The British people voted not to be part of that, and that's what we delivered.
Nigel, you're shaking your head listening to that. What do you say?
Yeah, maybe what you delivered, but this is what's happened. It's difficult to say, really. This was obviously going to happen. I could see that, but it's fairly naive because this country needs to trade with other nations, and if you sell a product, you've got to meet other people's regulations. So
and we understand.
So we understand that.
Well, David, were you naive in those negotiations not to have foreseen this?
The EU constantly regulates, it constantly brings in new rules, it constantly makes trade difficult. But I repeat my point that the only way you can avoid those things is by submitting yourself to EU control and EU rules, and that's what we voted against.
Right, well, Natalie, Keir Starmer wants a reset in relations with the EU, but you've just heard from Nigel and Adina. They were only told a week ago. I mean, do you think it's acceptable that the business department has not been able to inform fully businesses of what their sort of obligations are?
I think this is symptomatic of the Brexit that we got. In Bolsover, 70% of people voted to leave, the 17th highest in the country. They voted. They told me that they voted because they wanted to control immigration. They didn't get control in immigration. Immigration quadrupled after that. They did not vote so that small businesses could struggle in the way they're telling us. What we had is a government that negotiated a deal that meant that they didn't control immigration because we had to go outside for skills, but what they absolutely did is made people suffer and didn't make the most of the opportunities. Thank God we now have a government that is trying to reset relations with the EU, absolutely accepting the mandate that areas like ours gave them. We won't be going back in. That's not a thing. We won't be having freedom of movement. But what we will be doing is working with EU countries around these tariffs, working with EU countries around smashing the gangs like we have in Germany.
All right,
this
but
week.
David, do you want to respond?
Well, your government's policy is indeed not to go back into the EU. It's also not to go back into the single market and the customs union. That's your declared policy in the manifesto. If you don't go back into those things, you won't solve problems like this. So we actually have the same approach to this problem.
This is a consequence of the deal that you negotiated.
But what are you going to do? How are you going to reset to help Nigel and Adina? There's not going to be anything on the face of it now unless you go back into the single market or the customs union that will radically or materially change their situation.
This is one of the problems that we've been left with that we're trying to solve. So you're right that we are restricted, but we're working with the European Union and countries within that to make sure that we can reset the relationship so that small businesses of ours can absolutely benefit. Not going back into the EU, but making sure that our people are as well off as possible is absolutely the aim of this government.
Can I just remind you that when we were in the single market and the customs union, it cost us £15 billion every year for those privileges. How much are you prepared to pay now to get that back?
Because I've got this opportunity, I do want to ask you, because we're here and never probably going to have this opportunity again, people in my area, like other areas, voted strongly to control immigration. We saw net migration quadruple. Why was that not tackled?
Well, that's not really the question that's at issue. I am from an area that's just down the road from you, in fact, and I know very well what people think. Immigration is a different question. I don't think my government did a good job on that, but whatever had happened on immigration would not deal with the problem that we're faced with.
Let me just go back to Nigel and Adina. Listening to the two politicians, I mean, are you reassured by Natalie saying that the reset could change your situation and improve it?
Not really, no, because it's the timing of it. We're talking about tomorrow. We've tried to look for information. The only small flicker of light is part of it, which referred to Article 51, saying that if products are made available to the market before tomorrow, that they're exempted. We're clutching at straws to see whether or not that would cover what we do, but it's the lack of information. Nobody's actually available to explain this, to look at the size of business that we are. And there's so many more businesses like ours, that the one-size-fits-all legislation just really doesn't work. It's fine for huge manufacturers with lots of documentation, which they already do.
Right. Well, Natalie,
what we do just doesn't fit.
Natalie, the rules are coming in tomorrow, as we've heard.
Yeah,
just one moment. I'm just going to get Natalie, the Labour MP. I know you're not responsible precisely for the rules, but what advice would you give Nigel and Adina?
All I can say is how sorry I am that the absolute chaos of Brexit is going to impact them.
But your government hasn't done enough to keep them informed.
We absolutely are. We are trying to reset the relationship. We're trying to do better than the last government did moving forward.
Let me just come back here to Shabna. Broadly speaking, do you think the government should look more closely at a reset that includes much closer cooperation on trade?
I think we need to think about what benefits the people of this country and the people who have suffered the cost of living crisis, and some of that, how that's been exacerbated by and through this deal. But I did want to come back to just the conversation that was had between Natalie and David there, because I think it's so symptomatic of the problem of our politics, actually, that we have this really regressive and reactionary debate about immigration when we're talking about quite specific things related to trade and our relationship with the European Union. And I think that goes back to the debate that we had during the Brexit referendum, that we were much more concerned with winning back our borders, anti-migrant rhetoric, which was deeply racialised. And we didn't talk about these issues. None of these issues were the substance of the discussion. So, David, when you talk about that the British people voted for something, what they voted for and what they got are two entirely different things. But I also think that by kind of coming back to the immigration question and always making every issue, whether it's housing or this new rule change that's coming into effect tomorrow and affecting this couple, always bringing it back to the question of immigration, does the really damaging, poisonous work of encouraging racism and anti-migrant rhetoric that we actually saw explode into the racist riots this summer.
All right, get a response from both of you. David first.
Well, I didn't raise immigration in this context. Natalie did, but I still think that it has to be right that we're able to discuss immigration, the strains that come from it in this country. We have to have an honest, open discussion about it.
Right, and what do you say? Do you think that perhaps the debate is too focused on immigration, that it poisons the debate and the rhetoric around it when we're talking about trade with the EU?
I think that immigration is something that people I represent really care about. And I am sorry that you have examples of where it has felt like racism, but I always have to push back on my relatives, my friends, the people I represent ever being called racist because they voted to leave the EU. They are two very different topics.
And I 100% agree with you. I'm not in any way saying that people who voted to leave the EU are racist, but what I'm saying is that often our conversation, the political conversation around these issues, the policies that are related to the hostile environment have been racist and have had disproportionate impact on people of colour. So I think that there is a real difference between talking about individuals and accusing them of racism, which is clearly what I'm not doing, and actually talking about the systems, processes and the narratives that are encouraged by the mainstream, which do tend to locate almost every social issue to having a migrant or a Muslim cause.
You followed this debate around the EU Brexit for years, as have we all, in fact. What do you make now of this sort of practical situation that a business like Nigel and Dina's and their owners find themselves in?
Well, as you know, I voted and campaigned for Remain, but then subsequently served in government that was delivering Brexit. And I just want to pick up on a point that you just made, Shabna. I agree with you about not linking trade and issues of immigration because it creates a false framework. However, the reason that is quite often linked is because if, say, for example, the Labour government goes back in and tries to negotiate, hypothetically, a deal for the customs union, it is inconceivable that will happen without a trade-off on immigration. So actually, those things are intrinsically linked in terms of negotiation. And I think that sometimes gets conflated. On the direct issue, I feel very torn about this because, on the one hand, there is clearly a lack of communication from the government as to what is happening in the EU and the regulations that small businesses and exporters are going to have to meet in this country, and that is a failure of our system. On the other hand, as someone who voted Remain, I am slightly sympathetic to those people who face that red tape and regulation from the EU because this is something that all EU businesses and small businesses will have to comply with. So whether we were in or out, the new rule would be there. The issue here is that our small businesses haven't been made ready, which we were promised that they would be made ready for these new changes.
Well, I can see Nigel and Dina nodding away there. Just before I come back to you for a final word, just to pick up on what we heard from Salma, this headline in The Independent, Starmer's lead EU negotiator opens door to a major concession in Brexit reset talks. It's the headline. The European Affairs Minister, Nick Thomas-Symonds, has opened the door to agreeing a youth mobility scheme. Do you agree that in order to have better access, there will have to be some trade-off on immigration, like a youth mobility scheme?
So we have access to the single market now. The only way you can improve the deal that we have, except at the margins, is to become part of the single market. And you don't get to do that without trade-off on free movement of people. So, right, these things absolutely are connected.
Is it a trade-off worth making, not going back into the single market in the way David has said, but allowing a youth mobility scheme, for example, young people to come here from parts of the EU?
This government is committed to giving our young people every opportunity, but we are never going back to free movement.
All right. Final word from Nigel and Adina. What are you going to do between now and tomorrow?
Who knows? I would like to say one thing. I would like to say one thing about the lack of information. And
yes,
there was a comment about it being the government, as in the latest government. I think it's slightly unfair to blame the latest government because this is something that's been brewing since 2020. So it's this government and the last government that are responsible for the lack of information.
Well, Nigel... yes, go on, Adina.
We only discovered that after finding about this and then going searching, and it was on one of the EU sites that we found, I think it was June 2020, that this first in discussion, and all this time it's been going on in the background and nobody has been engaging with it in any shape or form.
Well,
the bottom line is we don't know what we're going to do tomorrow.
No.
Nobody can tell us whether we're exempt via Article 51.
Yeah.
And I'd love someone to explain that to me, please.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm sure the government's very unaware of how many people this affects. It's just loads and loads of people.
Is it 1.2 million small businesses?
Well, it's a lot of small businesses and in all sorts of fields.
Well, we're going to have to get you both back on in the next few weeks to find out exactly how you have handled it. And we'll task our team to try and find someone to explain it to you and others properly. Thank you very much. And on that theme, if you want to get in touch with BBC News with your concerns over anything, but including Brexit or business-related issues, please get in touch. You can see there on the screen via your voice, your BBC News, via WhatsApp, email or on online. All the details are there in front of you. Now, the Wall Street Journal has a new documentary about Liz Truss's 44 days as Prime Minister. The Wall Street Journal spoke to both Liz Truss and her then Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. Let's have a listen.
This establishment is dubbed by some American politicians the administrative state, or the swamp. In Britain, they call it the blob.
I think the blob describes wider than just the government. It's a groupthink shared by senior media executives, senior corporate executives, civil servants. Wouldn't it be better if experts and technocrats were running everything? That's a whole shared belief system. Big spending, big government, big taxes, big immigration.
The logical conclusion is that the government, the state, can grow an economy faster than the free market, faster than enterprise. And essentially that was the view of the Soviet Union. And we examined that proposition and it failed dismally.
Well, that was Kwasi Kwarteng there at the end. David Frost, is the blob responsible for Liz Truss's downfall? You were a key supporter.
Well, I think Liz Truss didn't go about things in the right way. I think that's the least that one can say. But I think she was trying to do something that was and is really important, which is to put the country onto a different path of deregulation and growth. And that still needs to be done. I don't believe she was brought down by a blob of any kind. I do believe she didn't get maybe the support from key institutions at critical moments that would have enabled her to push through some of these changes.
Oh, right. Oh, right. So you are blaming them, really, because they didn't support her in her mission for £45 billion worth of unfunded tax cuts, which set the market spiralling.
So that's one way of putting it. The way I would put it is that if she had stuck to her guns, maybe pulled back slightly, maybe communicated better with the bank, maybe communicated better with the city, she could have stayed in place and pushed through some of these changes. And if she had, I think the country would have been in a better place for it.
Really? I mean, clearly the markets did react the way that they did. She said in the documentary, Liz Truss, that she was scuppered by institutions like the Bank of England. She is really blaming everybody else for what happened.
I'm not going to defend Liz Truss and the way she went about things. What I am going to say is that she was trying to do something that was really important and maybe didn't go about it in the most prudent way.
Right, but if you have a look here, I mean, Keir Starmer, after 5 months, is also frustrated with the civil service. Keir Starmer riles the blob. Their headline says, civil service backlash after Prime Minister claims too many officials in Whitehall are comfortable in the tepid bath of managed decline. He's frustrated with it too.
I think that we can all look at Liz Truss and have a bit of a laugh about the Prime Minister that was beat by the lettuce. But the real issue here is that my mortgage went up £400 because of the decisions that she made. We can't all be elected MPs so that we can afford to absorb that. Instead, we've got a Conservative Party that still don't apologise for anything that she did, for the damage that she caused. And then worse still, voted for another leader that is very worryingly similar to her.
Oh, well, do you want to, first of all, apologise? Do you think the Conservative Party has learnt the lessons of what went wrong in terms of Liz Truss?
I'd like to hope so. It depends what you think the lessons to be learned are. For me, the lesson to be learned is that we didn't deliver the sort of change that the country needs if it's to grow and prosper in the right way in the future. Liz Truss tried that. I hope that Kemi Badenoch is going to get the chance to have another go at boosting growth, investment and reform in this country. You
would like her to do a similar sort of thing to Liz Truss? I mean, not the way she did it, but follow that path. Much smaller state, cutting spending and lower taxes.
What this country needs is a smaller state, lower taxes, lower spending, lots of domestic reform. There's no way around that problem, and the country will continue to get poorer for as long as we evade it.
Salma?
I think that there is definitely an appetite for some kind of radical change. And I think when you look at issues like housing, cost of living, when you look at growth and where the economy is, we've had a structural issue since 2008, as have lots of Western liberal economies. I think the issue is, if you're going to be radical, you've got to understand what your pathway is to delivery. You can't just be radical and then blame everybody else for it.
Do you think she'll be the next Prime Minister, Kemi Badenoch?
It's a long time to the next election, and more's the pity. I hope so.
For our sake, let's hope
not
not.
having you on Liz Truss. That's all for today. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back on Monday with more. Bye-bye.